After 15 months of constant theorizing, debates, arguments, and tons of reading, it's finally time for the end of Tales from the Pizzaplex. This will be my final summary for Tales from the Pizzaplex, and it will be for the final epilogue of the series. If you want to see my summaries for any of the other Tales stories, I've done a summary for each and every one of them, including the 3 main stories in Book 8, but now it's time for the epilogue of Book 8. So, will the ending wrap up everything in a satisfying way, or is it doomed to disappoint? Let's not waste any more time waiting, and let's just get started with the conclusion of the Mimic's Tales from the Pizzaplex storyline. The final epilogue picks up right where it left off at the end of epilogue 7, with Kelly having just died and the Mimic walking away wearing the blue dog costume that contained Kelly's corpse. Lucy had been so shocked, now being the only one left alive, and she was also really uncomfortable inside the rodent costume she'd been hiding inside. She scanned the room she was inside. She was alone outside of the big pool of blood on the floor where the Mimic and Kelly had stood just moments ago. She'd been so shocked that she hadn't listened for where the Mimic had gone, which was integral to her survival. She now had no idea where the Mimic was. She quietly moved over to the section of the wall with the rubble she and Kelly were trying to move. Even through the thick mask she was wearing and didn't want to take off in case the Mimic came back, she was able to smell the body of Nick, who was in the room and starting to rot. Lucia felt the desire to run far away from the room she'd last seen the Mimic inside, but she knew that no matter where she went, there would be nowhere to hide. The only way she could be safe was to kill the Mimic. She knew that the Mimic was only a machine and could be destroyed. It wasn't an invincible supervillain, but she didn't know how she would be able to destroy the Mimic. She knew, however, that there would be a way. Lucia could hear no footsteps indicating the Mimic wasn't nearby. However, this didn't make her calm. Lucia was oftentimes the type of person to isolate herself, but now being alone in a restaurant with a monster machine that had killed 7 people that she knew, some of whom she was friends with, and which was also still trying to kill her, was not the isolation she enjoyed. The only person who could help Lucia at the moment was herself. She began thinking about the costume room and remembered the Springlock Jester costume. Maybe she could get the Mimic to get inside the Springlock suit and have the Springlock snap back into place and crush it. Her rodent costume gave her the idea that the way you trap rodents is you create a situation where after it was where you wanted to be, it would have no choice but to go for the bait. That's what Lucia would do. She had to get to the costume room and ensure the only costume the Mimic could put on is the Springlock suit, so she headed back to that costume room. Her plan was easier said than done, as it was pretty difficult to ensure the Mimic couldn't get into any of the many costumes in the room, especially while wearing the rodent costume, which she didn't want to take off due to the fact that the Mimic could show up at any time. She ripped off the fingertips of the costume using her teeth, which was pretty gross, but then she had the problem of the rodent costume head getting in the way, so she took that off. Then she still had the problem of the rest of the fingers of the costume getting in the way. Begrudgingly, Lucia took off the rest of the costume and continued working at the zipper of the costume she was trying to decommission. However, she wasn't able to work the zipper properly, and when she tried to break the zipper off, it didn't make any difference. She shifted her task to looking at what she could find in the room. She tried to find a needle and thread to try and sew the costume shut, but she couldn't find any. She managed to find some pens and was able to stick them through the zippers and pull them down with them. When it worked, she said yes in excitement out loud. She worried about how loud she said it, but when she saw that she was still alone and didn't hear anything, she returned to work. She unzipped 6 of the costumes when suddenly the rest of the costumes on their hangers began swaying. She hadn't touched the other costumes, meaning that something had caused them to sway. The Mimic was here. She'd had the door in her line of sight the whole time, meaning that the Mimic hadn't entered the room. It was already here the entire time. Lucia didn't know which costume it was in, but she threw on her rodent costume as quickly as she could. The Mimic hadn't been in any of the costumes she'd fiddled with or unzipped, as she would have been dead by now. She'd been really lucky. She hid behind the costume she already tampered with, but she realized that she couldn't just hide forever or else the Mimic would just come out and kill her. When he eventually revealed himself, it would go into another costume, and Lucia had to make sure that he could only go into the Springlock costume. She had to continue unzipping the costumes like Russian roulette. Eventually, her luck ran out, and she found that the Mimic was inside the Gopher costume. She started moving away from the Gopher when she realized, but then the Mimic moved and got out of the costume, still in its spider-like configuration. Lucia began running until she saw that the Mimic was out and began slinking around the room. If she kept running, she'd get caught, so she hid behind a blackbird costume and a purple lion costume. There were only 2 costumes left for the Mimic to get into now. The last one she hadn't unzipped yet, and the Springlock suit. There was a 50-50 chance it would get into the right one. Instead, though, she suddenly found herself looking into the Mimic's eyes. It began trying to get into the costume Lucia was in. Lucia turned as much as she could and used her arms to unzip the back of the costume. When she looked back, the Mimic was making its way into the costume through the mouth, and the cold metal touched Lucia's chin, and then began compressing her head inside the costume. Luckily, she was able to unzip the costume and shoot out of it. The Mimic struggled to get in control of the costume, and Lucia took this opportunity to go to the pile of things she'd found in the room earlier and grab the rope. She tied the Mimic's legs together so it couldn't walk, but it could still move. Lucia dove behind the Jester Springlock suit, and she saw that the Mimic got out of the rodent costume, rearranged itself back into its original upright form, and it began moving towards the Jester costume. Her plan was working. However, suddenly, the Mimic stopped moving, its gaze darting around the room. Lucia stopped worrying about making noise and felt her fingers around the back of the Jester's Springlock suit and found a gap in the seam on its neck. She pried it open with her fingers, which she was able to do since it was pretty old, though not as old as the rest of the costumes. She stuck her head inside the costume and yelled for the Mimic to come and get her. All too quickly, the Mimic lunged at her, throwing itself into the suit like it had done with Kelly, but Lucia moved out of the way just in time. The Mimic was now inside the Springlock suit. Lucia grabbed a metal pipe and began smacking at the suit, trying to get the Springlocks to trigger. At first it didn't, and the Mimic began to get out of the suit through the Jester's mouth, and a piece of the suit had come off of it and began morphing into the Mimic's head. The Mimic shot its gaze at Lucia and opened its mouth. Lucia repositioned the metal pipe in her hand and shoved it into the Mimic's mouth, and as the Mimic jolted back, the Springlocks finally triggered. The room was filled with the sound of metal hitting metal as the Jester suit convulsed. A black liquid oozed from the Jester costume. It seemed to be some sort of oil, and it smelled pretty bad. Lucia felt a shred of hope, but just in case, she grabbed the metal pipe and left the room, shutting the door behind her. She wanted to run again, but she didn't. If she wanted to survive, she still had to get out of here, and to do that, she needed to know if the Mimic would still be a threat, or else she wouldn't be able to focus. She looked under a crack in the door and saw that the Mimic was still moving, but it was a victim rather than a victimizer now. It was vulnerable, and she didn't know if it might be able to repair itself. So, Lucia held onto her metal pipe and headed back into the room. The Mimic very well may have seen her, but it didn't try to attack her. The glow of its eyes seemed to be fading. Lucia acted. She remembered what she'd read in the manual about the Mimic and stepped into the spreading black oil, and she felt around the back of the Mimic's neck. She flipped the deactivation switch, and the Mimic went limp. It was over now. We cut to hours later. It had taken her a long time, but sunlight was finally laid on Lucia. She'd spent the past hours working at the concrete blocks and the metal on the wall over the window before finally being able to smash the window and began getting out of this awful place. She heard a voice calling out to her, asking what she was doing. Lucia tried to get out through the window, but she couldn't. She was just too tired. Suddenly, though, the hands of a construction worker gripped her forearms and pulled her up, asking what happened to her. She started to cry, and the construction worker let her know that she was okay. Lucia's mouth was too dry to allow her to speak, but she was able to smile. And with that, Tales from the Pizzaplex is finished. As an ending for the Tales from the Pizzaplex epilogues, this is a relatively satisfying ending, but only for what they are. I honestly don't think this epilogue is very good, but that doesn't mean it isn't a decent enough ending to the epilogues. The epilogues of this series are one of the very few things that I don't really like about the whole series, the other two being Haps and B72. I just think that the epilogues were mostly pretty underwhelming and weren't important enough for me to care that much about them, especially since the only real important lore is mostly in other stories or could have just been incorporated into other stories without being disruptive. Most of the epilogues outside of 1, 2, and 3 are really repetitive, and 2 isn't even that good anyway. I think the Tales epilogues could have been good as one story, shortened by a lot, while still keeping the same plot, and I think that would have worked better. The Tales epilogues have a good plot, but they just drag for so long. They're so repetitive, and most of all, they're just really unnecessary. There's so many other things they could have done with the Tales epilogues. So overall, I think this was a fine ending to the Tales epilogues as they are, but not as what they could have been, and as the final story in all of Tales from the Pizzaplex, it is a little bit disappointing. But that's the end of my final summary for Tales from the Pizzaplex. It's been a wild ride, and overall, I've been a big fan of the series as a whole. As I said, the epilogues were disappointing, but I think there were only 2 stories in the entire series that I actually think are bad, compared to probably like 5 from Fazbear Frights. But let me know in the comments your thoughts on this epilogue, on the entirety of the epilogues, and your thoughts on Tales from the Pizzaplex as a whole. But if you did enjoy this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to. I'll be doing a theory on this book as soon as possible, so stay tuned for that. But until then, I have one theory that I want to release between this video and the theory for this book. That theory will hopefully be out tomorrow or in a couple days, and it's not about an idea I really believe, just one that I wanted to suggest to get you guys thinking. So stay tuned for that, as well as the theory for this book. But until then, I'll see you all in the next video. Bye guys!